Hey, it's State of State. We got your Nittany Line update. It's a football discussion with Tom and Justin, so kick back and press play.
With former Penn State and NFL defensive back Justin King, I'm Tom Hannafin. This is State of State. This podcast is presented by BetOnline. BetOnline is your number one source for all your sports betting needs. Baseball, golf, soccer, plus all the top fights in MMA and boxing. Every stat, every matchup, and even live odds and spreads while the games are being played. When the game's over, head to the online casino and get in on a game of blackjack or poker or unwind with one of over 150 slots games. Head to betonline.ag today to get in on the action. Use our promo code BELIEVE, that's BLEAV, for your 50% free bet credit on your first deposit up to $250. State of State is presented by BetOnline. The game starts here. State of State is a proud supporter of Blue White Outfitters. Blue White Outfitters was created as a retail shop meant to highlight the confidence, competitiveness, and fearlessness of the elite athletes found throughout the history of Penn State University. Check out their Lockdown U and Lawn Boys merchandise today. All sales from Blue White Outfitters directly benefit Penn State student athletes. Visit www.bluewhiteoutfitters.com today. Happy 4th of July weekend, everybody. Welcome to State of State. I'm Tom Hannafin, flying solo today. This episode is all about the biggest games, tests, and challenges for Penn State football in 2024. Now, you're obviously going to look at the schedule and be like, yeah, Ohio State's going to be a big one. Washington's going to be a big one. USC on the road, that's going to be a big one. Of course, completely understand that. However, there's a lot of different elements and challenges within this season that I think need to be discussed overall in terms of what Penn State is going to be dealing with on and off the field, new faces within and outside the program to deal with, conference realignment, the travel that's going to come into play. There's a lot of things Penn State is going to have to deal with this year, and it's why I've been on the record a number of times saying that I think the potential record for Penn State football in 2024 in the regular season could fluctuate, in my opinion, anywhere from 11-1 to 8-4 in an absolute disaster scenario. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Let's dive into this. Like, comment, subscribe, rate us, turn on notifications, and comment. You guys are wonderful about commenting on YouTube. We appreciate it so much. And don't forget to get at us on social media at State of State Pod. Before I get into all these big games for Penn State this year, the big tests, the big challenges, I want to talk about some big news. During Independence Day, it was announced that there is another addition to Penn State's class of 2025. He is the son of LaVar Arrington. LaVar Arrington II is officially going to be a part of the Nittany Lion football program in 2025. I think this is such a cool piece of news. Penn State football, for the longest time, has had a rich tradition of multiple generations of families playing for this football team. And obviously, this is a football program that respects that history and respects those generational players. And listen, there's going to be a lot of pressure on LaVar Jr. altogether. The sticks, that number 11, made famous by LaVar Arrington, that legacy carried on by the likes of Micah Parsons very recently and currently in the National Football League and currently on Penn State's roster, Abdul Carter. There's a lot of weight that comes with that. Now, that being said, it doesn't necessarily mean that all of a sudden he's going to walk in the door and he's going to get the sticks. However, he will walk the door, and LaVar Arrington II is going to have all of that pressure, that hype, that expectation on him. But I think this is a perfect situation for him to come in if Tom Allen is still the defensive coordinator in 2025 and beyond that, by the time we get LaVar Arrington II on campus. Tom Allen is on the record saying that he deeply cares about the linebacker position and believes that it needs to be a point of leadership for the defense consistently. Now, you already have a great tandem of linebackers right now, as it is with Kobe King and potentially a Tony Rojas. That second position is still going to be ironed out once we get to training camp. Abdul Carter bumping to defensive end. But still, Penn State feels good about that. And you have leadership from Kobe King, a veteran. Tom Allen getting the opportunity to work with LaVar Arrington II, I think is so cool. And also, the thing that I think a lot of smart fans are going to look at is that, well, LaVar Arrington II is only a 3-star. Sure, I understand that. I'm not one that gets really hung up in the star ratings. He's listed at 6'3", 215 pounds at a Charter Oak in Covina, California. This now puts Penn State's 2025 class, according to 24/7 Sports, at number 8 overall. I think this is a cool situation, a good situation altogether for LaVar Arrington II. And that's not always the case. We've had Jimmy Kennedy here on the show talking about how his son committed to Iowa and just liked what he heard there and believes that's going to be a good place for him to be developed. No shade against Penn State. You have to make the right decision for yourself. It's not necessarily because, hey, my dad or my uncle went to Penn State, played at Penn State. I absolutely have to go there as well. So hopefully this is the right decision for LaVar Arrington II. Big expectations, big pressure on him, but very, very exciting. And this is a nice little piece of news on the 4th of July altogether. But let's get to looking at the 2024 schedule for Penn State football. Now, like I was saying, if you look at the schedule, yeah, you're intelligent people. You can be like, yeah, that Ohio State game is going to be a really big deal. That Washington game is going to be a really big deal. Opening the season on the road against West Virginia. Yes, I'm in the camp of Penn State football fans that 12.5-point spread that I believe was thrown out there when the kickoff time was announced initially for Big Noon kickoff as a part of Fox. 12.5 points to Penn State. I tend to agree with that. I would take that. But still, I think this is going to be a challenge for Penn State. One, opening up the season on the road in a hostile environment, never easy, no matter what. I think Garrett Gilbert, at quarterback, presents a challenge, more so than he did last year. I think getting that full-blown season to be the guy at WVU is going to show some progression for Garrett Gilbert and company. They run the football well. They have a very good offensive line. They did last season. That should carry over into this season. And it was the thing that I experienced going to the West Virginia game last year in State College, is that fan base, West Virginia, they wanted to see the upset. So imagine what Morgantown is going to look like kicking off this season on the road. So I think that is inherently, as you get out of the blocks, you have to consider that game as something that is going to be a big deal. That's Saturday, August 31st. Again, that's a noon kickoff in Morgantown, West Virginia. After that, things lighten up a little bit. And it's kind of an odd September. September 7th at home against Bowling Green. No disrespect. That should be a win for Penn State. Then you get a bye week. Then September 21st, you host Kent State. Should handle the Colden Flashes pretty easily. So you get that bye week there after 2 games. A little wonky early in the season, but it's kind of the new structure we're all dealing with as the Big Ten has experienced some conference realignment. And also you're going to get the 12-team playoff ultimately once we get into December and January. So a lot of things are changing. September 28th. This is when things really get brutal for Penn State, in my opinion. And I know there's a lot of fans out there that are not really thinking very much of Illinois. As one who attended the dreaded 9 overtime loss against Illinois years ago, I just don't count this team out. And even last season, I remember how Penn State on the road against Illinois really didn't get out of the blocks in that first half. It took them a while into the third quarter and fourth quarter to really wind up putting Illinois away. And it's also at this point in the season, we should start to have a pretty good understanding of what Andy Kotelnicki's offense looks like, how Drew Aller looks within this offense, how the running game looks altogether, how the wide receivers are playing altogether, offensive line, new tackle positions. This is about the point in the season, the September 28th game against Illinois at home, and then October 5th against UCLA, also at home. This is where you're going to really start to understand what you're dealing with. Now, that's on offense, and then especially on defense with Tom Allen. I expect very little drop-off from the Manny Diaz era in regards to what this defense is capable of being. Top 5, top 10 at the very least, but I do think Tom Allen is going to pick up where Manny Diaz left off. I think that Illinois game is a good time for Penn State to have that Big Ten opener. Again, you have a road game against West Virginia, Bowling Green at home, bye week, and then you have another game against Kent State. Again, you should be 3-0 by the time you get to that, but you got a full week to chill there in mid-September. Kent State, then Illinois, then UCLA. Illinois is going to be a great primer, in my opinion, for what appears to be a bit of a gauntlet run. At least in my opinion, I don't see too many breaks in this schedule altogether for Penn State. The whiteout could be Illinois or UCLA. I know a lot of people are still holding out hope that it's going to be Ohio State. Could be Washington, but more than likely this is going to be Illinois or UCLA. Illinois with Brett Bielema, I just never count this team out. Being able to run the football well, being just a sound team altogether. They did send some defensive players to the National Football League that I believe they're going to miss. And again, I do think this is a winnable game for Penn State. I swear to God, after that 9 overtime game, I am just never going to count out a game against Illinois. Then you skip ahead to UCLA, October 5th at home. You're inviting the first of these former Pac-12 teams into your house. UCLA doesn't give me a ton of pause. I do believe Penn State altogether is the more talented football team, but it's the unknown. Unknown at quarterback. Dante Moore transferring from UCLA to Oregon. So there's going to be some unknown at that position altogether. And I think the overarching thing to this is Deshaun Foster is the new head coach for UCLA. First-time head coach, former UCLA great at running back, standout for the Carolina Panthers for years. Deshaun Foster, you imagine, will have an emphasis on the running game, and that's been a strength for UCLA over the last few seasons, having some options at tailback that can be very, very interesting. And I think altogether, something Penn State struggled at times with last year was stopping the run. I am hoping that this year you see an emphasis on preventing that altogether. The interior of the defensive line is going to be tested against West Virginia, against Illinois, and potentially against UCLA. And again, this is going to be the point in the season where you really start to understand what you are altogether, and you'll be able to project ahead to USC, Wisconsin, Ohio State, Washington, Purdue, Minnesota, Maryland, as the rest of the season plays out. This is where you're really going to start to understand what you've got all together. And then you can really start saying, okay, what's our record going to look like? We're going 11-1. We're going 12-0, something like that. If you really think Penn State is going to knock off Ohio State at home. And I love the positivity, but that's a huge question mark altogether. But this is where you're going to start understanding what the rest of the season is going to look like on the field. And then also kind of that early positioning for the college football playoff. So that Illinois, UCLA, back-to-back home games, very, very positive for Penn State to have that advantage at home. But this is where you're going to start to understand what your team is all about. For UCLA, for me, it's the unknown. Fast forward a week, October 12th, you go on the road to USC. This doesn't scare me. I think scare is such a big term, but there's a couple factors. One, Lincoln Riley. Offensively, we know what this system is capable of. Miller Moss at quarterback. I think this is interesting, especially within Lincoln Riley's system. For those that don't recall, it was during the Holiday Bowl. Caleb Williams did not participate, getting ready for the NFL draft. So in step Miller Moss, who is slight altogether in terms of his build. So if Penn State's pass rush is able to get to him and beat him up a la Cade McNamara, the Iowa game last year, that could pay dividends. But Miller Moss, 23 of 33, 372 yards and 6 touchdowns in his first start at USC, leading the Trojans to a victory against number 15 Louisville in the Holiday Bowl, was named the Holiday Bowl MVP, set the record for most touchdown passes thrown in a Holiday Bowl, most touchdown passes thrown in a USC bowl game, most touchdown passes thrown by a USC quarterback in his first Trojan start, and tied the Pac-12 bowl game passing touchdown record. Okay, so you have that. USC is going to have their athletes. This is going to be a point in the year. Again, you should have an understanding of what you're dealing with, but let's not forget, while Penn State has tremendous depth at defensive back, safety especially, corner got hit a little bit by the NFL draft. Kalen King, Daquan Harney, and Johnny Dixon departing the program, intending to join into the NFL draft. He's dealt with some medical issues, but still, those are 3 big names that the secondary lost. If Miller Moss and USC are firing on all cylinders by the time that they host Penn State, that could provide some challenges altogether. Now, USC is going to open against LSU, then Utah State, then at Michigan, then home against Wisconsin, then at Minnesota, and then hosting Penn State. So they are going to have their own challenges coming into this game and have the potential to have 2 losses, in my opinion, on their record. And who knows going into this season how things could play out for USC. But there's a potential that if things go absolutely right, yeah, they could be in good shape. I don't like their chances against LSU and Michigan, but still, I'm leaning towards 2 losses for them. Still, that home game against Penn State, I think you do have to consider it as a challenge. And then it's also, remember, at defensive coordinator, it's no longer Alex Grinch, who would just give up points left and right and is ironically now a part of Wisconsin's staff. USC has Danton Lynn as its defensive coordinator, former Penn State defensive back, one of the best ever for Penn State at defensive back. So not saying that all of a sudden Danton Lynn is going to have some inside track on how Penn State plays. However, should be an upgrade defensively. At least I'm sure Lincoln Riley is hoping for that. And I think ultimately this becomes a challenge because this is where the travel element to this new Big Ten is going to start to come into play. Now, fortunately, the travel element of this new Big Ten is not really going to be felt with this USC game because October 12th, you're at USC, you go all the way out to LA, you come back, then you get another bye. So you have some time to recover. Had October 26th against Wisconsin been bumped to a week earlier, for instance, I'd be a little bit more concerned because then back-to-back road games like that, especially one cross country and then one to the middle of the country, yeah, I'd be thinking a little bit more heavily about this. So USC, I think, is a potentially losable game for Penn State. Again, I still like Penn State's odds thus far in the season. At this point, I'm putting Penn State at 6-0 through the USC game. Jumping ahead again, you get a bye week, and then you get at Wisconsin, October 26th. Luke Fickell and company have done a good job on the recruiting front. Phil Longo at offensive coordinator, had Tanner Mordecai last season and is going more for that air raid style, bringing what he was doing at UNC under Mac Brown. Here's where I don't necessarily love that that's what Wisconsin's style is all about. Yes, they're going to have tailbacks and they're going to run the football and they're going to have just absolute behemoths on the offensive line. Except quarterback looks like this. Braden Locke, redshirt sophomore transfer from Mississippi State. He'll be in the mix. Cole LaCrue at quarterback, redshirt freshman out of Colorado. Mabry Mature, I hope I'm pronouncing that right, 6'3", 232-pound freshman out of Texas. And then Tyler Van Dyke, who was the bane of Miami Hurricanes fans for a long time. 6'4", 227 pounds, redshirt senior, a lot of experience, but Tyler Van Dyke was consistently average for Miami. If you're a Florida State fan, you really loved Tyler Van Dyke last season, but I don't necessarily know if this is going to strike fear into Penn State. For me, it's the atmosphere. It's playing on the road at Wisconsin. I think it will create a challenge. I feel good that Penn State comes out of this one 7-0. But again, with USC on the road, bye week on the road against Wisconsin, that breather in the middle is certainly going to help Penn State. But Wisconsin, I just don't underestimate it, that environment as well. And who knows, is that something that gets bumped to a night game, potentially, whatever network picks that up. That can make it a little bit more challenging for Penn State. And then is it that proverbial trap game in that you had your bye week in between USC and Wisconsin, your second bye week. And then you've got Ohio State at home on November 2nd, the game that everybody is circling on their calendar and has been circling for a long time. I don't think I really need to go on this podcast and explain to everybody why the home game against Ohio State is one of the biggest games of the year for Penn State. It's the biggest game of the year for Penn State. Can the Nittany Lions win? It's really hard for me to sit here at this point in the offseason and say that. Ohio State has all of this hype, all of this momentum. Some people saying it's the best college football team ever assembled. We're not going to really have a feel for that, again, until September plays out. And then honestly, by the time this game comes around, that's when it's really going to be put up or shut up ultimately for Ohio State. And you got people like Ohio State quarterback Will Howard, the transfer from Kansas State, saying that it's winning the national championship or bust for the Buckeyes. Can Penn State play spoiler to that? You got to see how Ohio State is doing. Do they really have all of the firepower and ability to back up all of this hype? Does Penn State, on the flip side, have the right elements at play offensively and defensively with a new OC and a new DC and all sorts of new, hopefully, bells and whistles? Is Drew Aller clicking at this point in the season? Is Drew Aller ready to handle that big game environment that Penn State fans have been dying to see him take that next step? And also, this is another circumstance for James Franklin and company. It's a game potentially against the top 5 opponent at home. Manage this game as well as you possibly can. This is what bothers me about this game, is that consistently under James Franklin, when the team has gotten to these big games, there have been points of mismanagement in game, and then you just see the team not play to its fullest potential. Do we see the script flipped? For me, I said it on the very first episode of this podcast in 2021. I think about that 2018 home whiteout against Ohio State. I attended that game when the late, great Dwayne Haskins led a comeback against Penn State in the second half, and Ohio State won the game. 2018, James Franklin has the famous post-game press conference of, we've been a good football program, we've been a great football program, but we're not an elite football program. You beat Ohio State at home, you're elite. You're elite. So Ohio State on November 2nd, November 9th, at home against Washington. This is, in my opinion, the second biggest game of the year. Now, it's the challenge with Washington in that the mass exodus after the national championship, whether it was into the NFL draft or basically the University of Washington turning into the University of Alabama, it's so hard to know what Washington is going to be at this point in the year. I still expect ultimately for that program to be very, very competitive and field some athletes that are going to create some challenges for Penn State. Do they still have the same ability on offense under Michael Penix? I don't believe so. I think it's going to be a different look altogether. Some of that firepower is going to be lost, obviously, the likes of Roma Dunze going off to the NFL. They really only had one defensive end last year that was providing consistent pass rush. So is that something that's a factor? And if so, what are they able to do to Drew Aller and Andy Kotelnicki and the rest of this Penn State offense? That remains to be seen. Here's the thing that's tricky about the Washington game. Say Penn State loses to Ohio State on November 2nd. Is it that proverbial allowing one loss to haunt you and turn into 2 losses? That's my concern. Because if you drop this to Ohio State, now every game the remainder of the year is pressure-packed, trying to prevent that second loss so that you still have a chance to get in the college football playoff. Because really, 1 to 2 losses safely is what you're going to be able to afford to still qualify for the playoffs. So Ohio State and Washington, the 2 most losable games on Penn State's schedule. That being said, let's say you drop both games, Ohio State and Washington. Now you go on the road to Purdue on November 16th and November 23rd. You're at Minnesota. Inferior competition. Purdue, yes, has upset opponents at home in West Lafayette. So that environment, am I thrilled about that late in the year? Not necessarily. Penn State has dealt with that recently to open up the season in 2022. It all depends on what happens November 2nd and November 9th, Ohio State, Washington, because it could be a domino effect. I don't expect Penn State to lose to Purdue, Minnesota, and Maryland to end the year. But again, if you lost both, depending on how the rest of the country is looking in terms of qualifying for the playoff, is the team completely locked in the rest of the year to finish business and make sure that you finish with just 2 losses? Purdue, Minnesota, I personally think PJ Flex's days are numbered at Minnesota. I think he's a used car salesman altogether with this stupid row the boat stuff. And I think the jig is up at some point in the very near future, but we'll see. And then to wrap things up, November 30th against Maryland. The only way that stretch of Purdue, Minnesota, and Maryland turns into a string of big games is if things go dismally bad against Ohio State and Washington. The Purdue one, yeah, that can make you nervous a little bit, depending on how things feel. Realistically, I think at worst, Penn State has the potential to drop 3 to 4 games. I think realistically, they drop 1 or 2 games. And those games are probably going to be Ohio State and or Washington. There's some elements within this schedule that I think are going to make things very challenging for Penn State. New opponents, the travel element. They're very fortunate with where their bye weeks are placed. Had that USC Wisconsin game been back-to-back on the road, for instance, I'd be a little bit more nervous. But ultimately, I feel good about the way that this season is set up. Again, that looming opportunity of the 12-team college football playoff is a blessing and a curse. You have a little bit more room for error, a little bit more margin for error altogether. But still, you drop one, you inherently get tense. The pressure gets ratcheted up. I'm very curious to see by the time we get to Illinois and UCLA, late September, early October, what this team is. And I think the road game against USC is where we really discover, okay, what is Penn State football in 2024? Thank you all so much for joining us. This episode and our entire library of shows is available now on YouTube, Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Google Podcasts, and wherever else you get your podcasts. Also, let us know what you think of the show on social media and check out all of our content on X, Instagram, and TikTok. Search for the handle @StateOfStatePod. State of State is presented by Bet Online and by Blue White Outfitters.